Okay.
Okay?
Yep.
All right. Okay, so this is our second conversation, and I think it's an honor to get to play with all of you like this. And I have no idea where this is going to go, but what we have to kind of start off with today is this subject of collaboration. And I think if any of our listeners, watchers have been working in systemic programs or projects, this question of collaboration and the need for collaboration is something that comes up pretty frequently. And you get quite a bit of work out there that has this kind of hypothesis at the end of it that says we need collaboration. And the we is like which we, and the collaboration is which collaboration, and what do you mean by that? Because I think just to kind of open it up, it can be tempting to apply mechanistic notions to this idea of collaboration. It's really easy to think that collaboration means you do what you do, and I do what I do, and they do what they do, and we're going to get together and we're going to make a functional system. Right? And when you're working with projects or situations in which you've got multiple entities that are necessary. Okay, you're working with a school, you've got parents, you've got teachers, you've got the kids, you've got the local government, you've got the health well-being processes of health ministries, you've got the law, you've got mental health, you've got sports, and you've got all kinds of different people that are involved with the children, with a school. And so you could think all of these entities have to collaborate for the improvement of the well-being of the children. And so the temptation there is to think that the teachers need to bring good teaching, and the people who are doing sports need to bring good sportsmanship and coaching and opportunities for sports, and that everybody needs to do their thing to create collaboration. But where this gets, I think, interesting in complex living systems is when the various parties, entities, contexts actually have to go into some kind of mutual learning. They have to go where they haven't gone before. So it isn't so much about bring your expertise and lay it on the line, and I'll bring my expertise and lay it on the line. It's bring everything you've got and bring your willingness to learn, to see what you haven't done before. Something, that it might be kind of more akin to improvisation. But of course, I'm going to open this up to all of you to kind of address some of the situations here, because one of the issues is that the systems that we are living within are inherently competitive, they're inherently extractive and exploitative, and they are actually generating long histories of pain and resentment and contradiction, double binds, as my dad would talk about. So we're kind of in the middle of all of those things, and sort of saying, and now, kumbaya, everybody, we're going to have collaboration. And it just isn't that easy. And the rigor that I think is needed to actually approach collaboration is worth a conversation. So with that, I'm going to open it up to all of you.
Well, that's kind of what Robert Hutchins' Institute was all about, when he had the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, which has such a strange mouthful of a name, but he invited my father to be a fellow there, and Dad was a biologist, a theoretical biologist with a lot of laboratory training, but still not someone who you would think would have anything to offer on economic issues and poverty and inner city crime. And, he was from Brooklyn, but that was kind of separate from his scientific chops. And yet he found not only did what he knew about biological systems apply, but he learned stuff. I mean, he started looking at his own discipline differently. And that is where he developed anticipatory systems theory, and the whole modeling relation really kind of fit into all of that. I mean, it was for him his favorite professional experience doing that. And, you know, he didn't really like people all that much. And yet every day was, they start the day with a dialogue, because that was very important to Robert Hutchins. And so they'd all sit around a table and start throwing ideas around about whatever the problem of the day had been chosen. And he found, to his surprise, that a lot of what he had thought was important wasn't, and what he didn't know if it would apply did. And so for him, it became kind of a fascinating experience. And looking on it from my point of view, I think the main reason he found that it applied is because we're alive. You know, and all of our problems are kind of life problems. They're based on people trying to anticipate and doing it poorly, or not having enough support when they do it well, or any of those things. I mean, it's, you know, the whole mechanistic thing of science is an anticipatory problem. So that, I think, is why it all ended up, you know, shocking the hell out of him. But he developed anticipatory systems theory because of that. So the collaboration and going out of your comfort zone, you're right on the mark as far as his experience. And definitely, you know, he wouldn't have been doing the work he was doing if it hadn't been for that. So
what did he say about the situations where people have to cross silo boundaries, where things are happening in one department and people can often have careers, they've got salaries, those systemic forces which can often persuade people to say, no, things are fine, things are okay. How did he, what would he have said in those situations?
Well, that's why he got involved with systems early on, because that is a very typical mechanistic, you know, fractionate a big system into smaller parts, study the parts, put all the data back together, but you've destroyed all these relations and interactions and feed forwards and feedbacks. And so you will not get the same information no matter how much you study the parts, right? So he felt not only was systems approaches needed to be developed better, and we need to learn how to study things like relations and organization of systems, not just you know, the network idea, but relations as components, and how does that change the expression of what's interacting, you know. And that's the kind of thing that we still haven't figured out entirely, but a lot more people see the need for it. So I think, you know, it will come. We just need to kind of push it, I think, in the right directions and make sure it doesn't go astray. I do think in the system society, there's this drive by some people to try to define a general system, and that my father was warning about when he was president in 1980 or 81. I mean, he was saying that is the wrong direction to go. You want a general theory of systems. You don't want a theory of a general system. That takes all the usefulness of the systems approach and throws it right in the dumpster. So that, for him, was a big issue. But and that one, you know, still in the last, I'd say, 5 years, we've had a couple of people talking about a general system.
We've been debating that a little bit in the College of Systems Thinking Moderation chat, almost, I think, by accident. But it does feel, you know, maybe it's just what's crossing my radar at the moment, but it feels as though I know of at least 3 initiatives, 3 people who are talking about something down one or other of those lines. And many people, at least 2 of them, don't care or don't distinguish. I think Derek and Laura are participating in something along one of those lines in the third part, and that's the kind of collaboration I'm interested in talking about. how do we collaborate in growing a field, in growing an approach, a thing, when we don't necessarily agree with everybody else's approach, and things get swept in and swept out that we think should be valued or shouldn't be valued. Yet, how do we stay in the same room, in the same Facebook groups, in the same learned societies, and kind of build up something useful together, even though there may be that disagreement?
Well, it beats the hell out of me.
I'm going to leave that hanging. That's all right.
Yeah,
I mean, go ahead, Derek.
There's so many different tracks we could go on Ben's track. Yeah. One thing I guess I would comment on is just the, sometimes I think we think of collaboration as like an action, but I think collaboration is an emergent property, and so whether or not collaboration occurs has some kind of agent interactions that I think is where the focus of collaboration would be, rather than on the outcome. So, are we listening? Are we, in our language, are we building the same mental models? And we can know that by looking at the DSRP structure and the informational structure. And are we actually building the same mental models? Which is kind of the equivalent of Shannon's communication theory, except, in people. And are we building those relationships, and what we call RDSs, like relationship distinction systems? Like, are we actually zooming into those relationships? We're working a lot to Peter's notion of silos. That's one of the main things that we are asked about by organizations, and they're in a tough spot because they're getting big, and so they have to departmentalize to some extent. They have to break into parts as just a survival mechanism. And when they break into parts, like Judith said, you break the relationships. But how do you rebuild those relationships, or try not to break them in the first place, and still have departmentalization, which is sometimes needed? But then how do you build those relationships, and can we distinguish and systematize them purposefully? One of the things we talk about a lot is that you have to have, if you're going to make relationships between silos, between departments, somebody has to be in charge. Somebody has to be responsible. There has to be FTE, full-time equivalencies, budget for the relationship. And that's something that companies and organizations don't really think about. They don't think the budgets and FTE are allocated in departments. They're not allocated in relationships.
Yeah.
So there's no metrics in a relationship. There's no FTE that's associated with a relationship. There's no budgets that are associated with relationships. And so we ask the question, well, if you're not assigning any of those things which kind of make the department go to the relationships, then why do you expect them to occur? Why would you expect a relationship to form?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Derek, I just can I ask a question, Derek? In terms of forging those relationships, as someone who was at one point a corporate project manager, yeah, I effectively found myself having to be a linguist, working between different departments because of the different languages at work in those departments, and you needed to be able to speak those languages. Is it important to be able to have the ability to switch languages when you're building relationships between departments?
I think it's certainly a language issue, but I think it's beneath the language. It's a structural issue. Sometimes we're calling the same thing, but thinking different. So we're using the same word for things that are different. And sometimes we're using different words for things that are same. So language alone won't get us there. We have to look at the underlying structure of mental models. When I say that we have to kind of DSRP from both ends, like Shannon communication theory, that's what I'm saying is, you got to go deeper than the language being used and find the underlying structure to find out whether we even agree when we think we agree, or whether we disagree when we think we disagree, because a lot of times we don't. And we're not going to get to that level of understanding without going down to that mental model structure level.
Yeah.
This is a lot of what we're, oh, go ahead. Sorry,
well,
go ahead.
Building off of what you were both saying, I also think part of the issue is, at the agent-based level, like you're talking about, there's collaboration, but there's the collaborator. And what does a collaborator need to think and do in order to focus on the collaboration, right? So in a weird way, we come to collaboration as, what am I going to bring? I'm the expert in this. And it's like you were saying, Nora, you do, I do. And those things combine, and then magically collaboration happens. Well, it's not really like that. It's more like, what can I bring and what do I not bring and therefore need to learn? And how do I do it? There's focus on the relationship between, my strengths, my weaknesses, the opportunity for us to really, what you were talking about, mutually learn from each other, which I think comes at the level of the mental models that we can build and share and evolve together to a common meaning, which is what leads to the product of collaboration. And I actually think where we disagree is where the rich stuff is, right? That we need to really embrace disagreement and not be afraid of really following those where they lead, and then looking for a commonality underneath where we disagree on the surface. Because I think, especially in systems thinking, I think there's probably a lot of common ground. That
Peter Jones is being taken away by the aliens. I'm sorry, I was distracted. Yeah, I get what you're saying, Laura. And in the spirit of where we disagree is the richest territory, I get worried when people talk about mental models. I understand a lot of the value, but I feel as though a mental model is a metaphor that's too easily lost as a metaphor. There's a risk that it is behavioralism in disguise, really. I recently came across Toby Lowe's definition of community as a group of people who share an identity-forming narrative. And I want there to be, it sounds as though there's a very concrete, real thing there that you can descend to, and then you've got the mental models, and then you can build from solid ground. And I realize that in practice, that may be a process that can work. But I don't think that that's a good reflection of the richness of how people actually relate, if that makes any kind of sense.
I think your definition of mental model is different. That's a perfect example there.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean,
all of ours probably are.
Because according to anticipatory systems theory, all of our behavior is driven by models, either somatic models or mental models. And to think of them in a discrete, like formal term, like a science model, is not what he was talking about. I mean, no. I've actually given talks on this, because the way you know that they're models driving our behavior is because they can be wrong and they can be fooled. And the interactions in ecosystems are all about that. I mean, mimicry and camouflage, and trying to put another organism into a state of error in order to either protect yourself from them or to make it easy to catch them and eat them or something. They're constantly interacting with each other's models, and that's so outside of science. In fact, it's completely backward to the point where I said the only reason we can do this in science is because nature allows it. It's entailed in the universe. So we've built that into ourselves as a system. All living organisms have, and it's the way they navigate. It's the way they do what they do, and they are all based on their own encoded models of some kind. And it's never really been studied how it's encoded. It's not all DNA. There's other modes of encoding, but this is one of the things I've been sort of saying, study this. Students study this.
There's quite a
So what for you is the?
I think that it's also there's a larger cultural issue that is going on as well, which is that in the larger world, whether you're trying to create collaboration in a household or in an organization or in a government or something, in the larger world in which we co-inhabit, there is an accepted, legitimized daily existence that is premised around what's in it for me.
Mm-hmm.
And then we create these kind of false oases where, okay, but in this space, we're all collaborators. And the fact is that you just can't hold that boundary. It's going to continue to be in the permeated, leaking in with the existing culture. I mean, I cannot tell you how many ironically disturbing situations I've been in where I have been, talking about collaboration and had the ideas ripped off, right, by people in the systems space, because that's where we are, right?
Mhm.
So who's got the coolest idea about collaboration becomes this way of kind of saying my accomplishments are my own, which is actually, once you're there, you're not doing collaboration anymore. Are
Mhm.
your accomplishments your own? Are they?
Yeah.
Are they? Or are they coming from context? Where are your accomplishments coming from? How did you get to bring what you're bringing? And so I think there's this outside issue that continues to bubble in, that legitimizes a kind of, gotcha, and a kind of leveraging. And as long as you've got that, why would I not hold back? Right? That's, for me, that's part of the question. How do you sort of create relationships where there's not systems hold back?
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. There's some research that Laura and I have been investigating recently that has really kind of put a fire in my brain around, a lot of people talk about trust, right? And trust is obviously incredibly important in collaboration and other social systems. But it turns out that our thinking on trust is completely backwards. We think that if we build trust, that vulnerability will occur. But it actually happens in the reverse scientifically, that the way that we build trust is to exhibit vulnerability. That vulnerability comes first, and then trust occupies that space. And so, but like what you're saying, Nora, it's very difficult to sort of be like, oh, you're in it for yourself, I'm going to be vulnerable, right? Like, that's kind of a hard choice to make, right?
Right.
Mhm.
That's true.
If I
And
go
also
back to what if I go back to what Judith was saying, I mean, it got in my mind. I was thinking, if we're talking with somebody, even if I agree with what Nora is saying, you can be in a collaborative space, but then somebody can say something, and you can say, "Well, hang on a minute." There's a kind of like a warning flag scenario, and you kind of got to deal with that warning flag scenario, in that moment, because you kind of got to get back to the point where you are still able to collaborate. I mean, is that how does that work in your situation, Judith?
Well, I can tell you, I'm a meditator. I'm a Vipassana meditator, and I see meditators doing stuff like this too. They're supposed to be much more balanced than your average bear, right? And sometimes,
Supposed to be.
sometimes, I wonder, what are they not doing right with their meditation that they're that ego driven still? I don't know. It's a tricky thing with human beings, because we live in our heads, a lot of the time. I know I do.
It might be self-selection bias too.
Yeah, could be.
I'm not saying that to you. I'm saying like that the people that are being drawn to meditation might actually have a self-selection bias.
That could be. I was certainly a mess when I started. But I mean, it is something that I see in human beings, and the more ambitious they are, the more trouble there is likely to be, because they haven't balanced it with enough alternate viewpoints. I mean, I think the more viewpoints you can collect, and the more counterexamples to anything you think is true, because that's become my modus operandi, is to look for counterexamples. And I've got, a whole mental collection of them for almost everything that I at one point thought was the case. I mean, some of the people that I know in the system society who really believe in this idea of a general system, that there could ever be such a thing, are actually very good people, good people who care about the world and stuff. They're not just in it for trying to get a Nobel Prize or something. These are people that actually do care, but they're going down the wrong path and they don't want to hear that. So how do you represent, how do you illustrate for people what you're seeing the problem is? You know, I have not succeeded yet so far with that. When there is real strong ambition and they've got a very clear mental picture, a mental model basically of where they think they're going, and I'm looking at them from a different perspective, and to me it looks like they're going off the side of a cliff, you know, that they need to update their GPS. And how do you show them this without the booby traps, without the triggers? Triggers are a big issue.
It's
And
a really good question, Judith. It's such a good
has
question.
anybody figured it out? I think, Nora, you may be the most successful at that because you've always been very graceful in your social interactions, and I've watched you deal with hecklers and make them feel listened to and make them feel like they've been heard, and yet also change their mind a little bit. I've seen you do it, and I'm like, wow, I can't do that. I would like to know how to do that. So
when it comes to explaining things, I think explaining things is not as easy as people think it is. I think it's actually more, it's a lot more nuanced.
So how do you do that, Nora? When you hear somebody, who's angry and says, "You're not," but you should talk about this.
I think it's so obvious to me. I mean, one of the things that you brought up, Judith, is ambition. And I consider, I mean, in my own personal way, there is a flavor of ambition that when I smell it in a systemic conversation, in a space where we're supposed to be doing systems work together, it's the flag. And I can, right away, okay, this is not systems thinking.
Okay.
Right away, it's just not. If you're trying to get ahead here, this is not, we're not on the same page. So for me, this is where the warm data comes in. This is that trans-contextual process, right? So for the most part, that shifting happens when there is the possibility of bringing other contextual relational process into the conversation in a way that is actually about mutual learning. And this is, I think, one of the reasons we wanted to have these conversations was about tone. And so much of, I think, what is in the communication is in the tone. And there is the part of the tone that says, hey, I'm actually going to stay warm and open here. And I'm also going to make this more rigorous. We're going to go further because I'm not going to give up on you. And that is a position of dignity and kindness and human warmth. It's relational. It's saying, I'm not going to hold back, right? The minute you go into hold back, then the other person goes into hold back. And then the relationship becomes emaciated and there's nothing left in it. The vitality is gone. So how to keep that vitality there? And without it, so I think for me, that's what happens, is that instead of perceiving the animosity, what I perceive is the potential impoverishment. And then my response is to that impoverishment instead of to the polarity.
There are some people. Sorry, Ben, go on.
So just right back to where we started in the conversation in mutual learning. It's no surprise that that's a reflection of what you said at the start and what you said just now, Nora. The value and risk of surprise in collaboration can't be underestimated. And actually, in a lot of my organizational development work, people will do an awful lot to avoid surprise. and to avoid being in it personally, if you see what I mean. There's so much in organizational life which is about maintaining a predictable state that protects them from all the things that you're talking about as important and valuable, Nora and Derek and Laura, the vulnerability effectively. And Nora, you're talking about continuing to hold that space. And we often say in our organizational development work, you don't have to resolve conflict, but you have to show that the relationship continues. The relationship may be mildly damaged, as the Stephen Pyle cartoons that I love so much comment when people are playing games and arguing with each other. But the important thing is that the relationship continues. So I think that's fundamental, and sticking with it. Of course, sticking with it, I want to sort of raise this spectre. I think I said this last time. I don't know why I'm saying this, but there are sociopaths in the world. There are people who will deal with vulnerability. There are, to whom that being vulnerable is both is a trap both ways. So you have to be balanced, but maintaining the relationship is actually the secret to collaboration, really, isn't it?
Nora, I'll just come back and also adding what Ben was saying. There are people in the ecology of systems thinking where I have tried very hard to retain the relationship, but there are luckily a very small number, I'm pleased to say, but there are some people where I just cannot. I mean, there comes a point where I think sometimes you have to say, I can't do that. What's your, are you able to kind of look after everyone, or is it just not possible in some cases?
I mean, of course, it's not possible in some cases, but I also think that one of the things that happens is that the conversation becomes a ping pong game of direct correctives, and you get caught, answering the question that has been brought up. And that, we know that directness is never going to unravel the double bind there.
Mm.
So as long as you're in direct binarying, you can't do it. So you have to go to another context and respond from another direction. And I think that we just can't forget that basically the world is on fire. There's people out there that are that are really nowhere close to being able to do some of this stuff. And then there's people who are actually really close, and they might piss you off some days, but they're actually really there. This is a family, and sometimes we bicker, but basically I think it's important to tend that warmth in whatever way that it can be tended.
On the plus side, I've met some wonderful people.
Along those lines, and I go back to something Judith said about counterexamples. I mean, I'm a person that, being vulnerable, I guess, somewhat, whenever I'm in a room full of people that are vehemently agreeing, I get uncomfortable. So, when we talk about certain things, we should have counterexamples that check ourselves, right? So is it true, for example, that people who have ambition can't therefore be systems thinkers and therefore can't collaborate, right? I mean, I don't find that to be true. I think there's plenty of people with tons of ambition who collaborate all the time and think systemically. Yeah. So we want to be.
Ambition is not a negative at all. It's the imbalance. It's the the kind of tragedy of the common type of ambition.
Yeah, that type of ambition where you're trying to get more than what you.
That's
but
what
ambition.
I'm about.
If ambition was a crime, my father was guilty. So.
Right. Yeah, where do we draw the distinction on what ambition is? I mean, if I want to have a home, is that ambition? If I want to provide for my children,
or if you want to even have a name for yourself and your own work, that's not a negative, as long as it's not at the expense of the truth. He ran into scientists, and I've seen some of them, not very many, but who were willing to suppress the truth because
Mhm.
they had their own twist on the ideas, and some of them are doing, using my father's work, okay, and they're trying to put their name as synonymous with anticipatory systems theory, and they want to suppress. There was one who actually delayed republication of the second volume of anticipatory systems theory.
Yeah.
Because he was busy putting his own spin on it and saying this is what it is. And my father's book is, of course, much more comprehensive, and would have, if anybody bothered to read it, they would see this guy is like full of hot air and doesn't really understand what he's talking about, right? And so that kind of ambition is negative. That's not based on talent or on trying to really uncover the truth. That was the kind of ambition my father had, and I think you've got some of that kind of ambition. You've got the ability to see, like I remember you quoted, we were having an argument online with some people who were saying that theoretical science isn't really science. And you said there's nothing more practical than a good theory, and it was a quote from somebody, physics. Yeah. But that is the absolute truth. And so, the ability to see how theoretical science applies and how it guides the development of new approaches in science and new techniques in science, you've got to have the direction correct, because otherwise you go for a general system. That's where the problem is for me. But the people that, I can't tell if it's that they just don't see that it's the wrong direction, or whether they've invested too much of their own name and time and energy into that direction, and they're going to just insist that it's correct because they want it to be. That's
Or
the
because they need to sell it.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that I've seen is people making promises about what their systems based project is going to do, what the results are going to be before they've started. And really it has to do with the fact that they have to sell those results because they need to get the gig. And that's at the expense of, that's that part where we're looking at the system as the organization, and that system doesn't include the community or the biosphere.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of damage done in the name of systems theory right there. And it was about getting the gig. And I think, to your point, that was that place where it was like, yeah, I know the system includes the ecology and the community and the family and blah, blah, blah. But, they don't need to talk about that. They're just interested in their own organization.
Oil companies are right there, where they externalize everything that's inconvenient. That's not part of our business plan. So they build a model that deliberately excludes those points, of interaction, and so it doesn't show up on the bottom line, kind of thing. And that's just really mechanistic approaching. They're dealing with biological systems, they're dealing with complex systems interacting, and they don't really understand that their goal is so oversimplified. When profit is the only goal in healthcare, health is lost. It might as well be anything else. It could be the oil industry. And so there are certain things where, as living organisms, we have to recognize that you can't externalize that, and you can't make an artificial goal that completely ignores what the industry is supposed to be about. Just boggles my mind that it's just so obvious to me. But I don't really know how to get people to recognize it. So how do you, aside from saying, well, we're alive here, this may be about economics, but it's the economics of living organisms called human beings. And how do we factor in all the complexity of human interactions into this? I mean, when you look at like the stock market futures, right? That's running on pure mental models right there. That's all prediction from inside people's heads based on what? And how good are their model building skills? I have to question. It's a really frightening thing to realize that, so much of our economy runs on fear, panic, and ego. And the predictions that come out of the models. Pardon?
Can we get other systems to kind of provide some outside pressure? For example, I saw Kiss the Ground recently, and Kiss the Ground have got a website, and on the website they've got communities, and people are presumably joining up to those communities. Haven't quite joined up myself, but if people start lobbying from communities, say like Kiss the Ground, or there's Donut Economics Action Labs, they've got communities. If those communities were able to lobby, let's say, oil companies, is that something that would be helpful?
So if you could get these communities to talk to the oil companies about like the complexity of, I would love that. How do you arrange it though? I think that might be useful.
One example that an organization that we worked with that had a lot of influence over data in health choices, and so we're talking about food choices for individuals and on a daily basis, and also exercise choices. And one of the things they talked about was utilizing their data set so that they could leverage restaurants. Their issue with the world, which I thought was just phenomenally intelligent, was it's very difficult to be healthy. It's actually harder to be healthy than it is to, it's easier to be unhealthy than it is to be healthy. And so what they said was, well, we can leverage this data set and this technological app essentially to go to restaurants. And we can say to them, look, we can throw customers that are living within 15 blocks of your restaurant your direction, but we'll only do that if you change your menu to be more healthy. So to me, that's a really unique use of a complex adaptive system based on the individual choices of agents and what those agents want, and how you can take that and leverage systems that otherwise won't be leveraged because they're leveraged by other things like the cheapness of the food or whatever. That's one example. It's not oil industry, but it's certainly a large industry.
And it's operating with the relationships.
Yeah.
It's basically, you go looking first for structural change, but it turns out that the relational change comes first and the structural change comes after.
Which is why I always get myself in trouble saying that this idea that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. It's such an important idea to not think that, because to not think that is to understand that the relationships are part of the whole. The only reason that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts is because we've externalized the relationships.
Right.
And if we internalize the relationships, which is where they actually exist, then the whole is exactly equal to its parts, with those parts being relationships.
But there are also interactions, like ongoing, time is when you look at, say, the human physiology, you have to recognize that interactions, metabolic interactions, repair interactions, all of these kind of cycles of behavior are constantly interacting. They're part of each other. And that's where body heat as a component of ours comes from. And I've tried to describe how important it is to sort of look for that, because while it's intact, time is still a part. It's still running through time, right? But if you kill it and start dissecting it, you lose the body heat and all the interactions that created that, and all the interactions that manage body heat within a very, very narrow band of what's considered normal. You start to feel pretty awful when you go 1 or 2 degrees above. And going like 5 degrees above in either direction can threaten your life, right? So it's something that our body needs, and it needs it very tightly controlled. And so what component is that? It's a side effect of all kinds of other ongoing interactions, which are just as much. So the relations by which those interactions are occurring are critical components. The interactions themselves are components. And then the effects, the products of these interactions are also components.
That's right.
So the initial relations,
interactive components,
Right.
And
then
then
they interact with the
greater than
effects,
some, then,
exactly.
It's sort of a
So body heat is like regulated. So there are relations to all kinds of other aspects of our physiology with body heat. Like, we're going to get into the too much information part again, but the whole reason men have a scrotum, let's say, is because of body heat, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and tight pants are bad for fertility for men, and that's one of the first things that they'll tell you if you're trying to procreate and you're having trouble. They'll look at the man first, right, and say, what kind of underwear are you wearing and stuff. I mean, it's astonishing that. So there's one thing right there. The initial relations would be obvious components, but the interactions that create heat, and then the relations at other aspects of your physiology that regulate heat, are also then relational and interactive components, and they all disappear when you fractionate the system. So there would be no way to understand body heat at all if all you ever studied were cadavers.
That's right.
You would never be able to get there from any amount of study of biochemistry that's left behind and stuff. And certainly you wouldn't understand the impact of hypothermia or a fever, or, why the human body is built the way it is. And so many other species have the same issue with heat, with reproduction for males and stuff. It's really endlessly, complex. And so when I try to talk about organization and the fact that we have very few ways of analyzing organization while it's intact, looking for not just the relations by which interactions you can see are going on, but what regulates that. And does it need to be regulated, and why? And so looking for, you end up with like feedbacks in service of feed forwards that are in service of feedbacks that are, it all kind of keeps blending together and moving, and it's in constant motion. So
which
time
actually is
Pardon?
Collaboration.
Yeah.
Right?
All
That is
collaborating.
what collaboration actually is.
And the organization is kind of what specifies all that collaborating.
Right.
So it becomes kind of so when you talk about
Specifies,
living,
constrains and enables. I mean,
right, exactly. It kind of hems it into what it needs it to be, right? So the relations are really very important, and yet they're invisible components, and we need to change how we look, what our vision is. What we have to look for the effects of these kinds of interactions so that we can see the relations too. That becomes really.
That's why we talk so much about, one of the things we hit on it's like our greatest hits is RDSing, that we have to see relationships as distinct and systems in and of themselves.
Yep.
Because if we don't learn to see these relationships
Exactly.
as components of the whole, not as externalities of the whole.
No, not as incidental.
Components of the whole. Then
Exactly.
we have nowhere to go systemically if we do that.
And it's not
Right.
obvious to a lot of people at all.
I know. We have to make it obvious somehow. This is, I've been talking about trying to come up with a game, like a model that would illustrate what I call the causal impact of relations in some context. Because some way that people could play with the values only of the relations. So they could change the values of the relations, not the things that are interacting, and then run it out in a simulation and see what the changes are in the outcomes. And it's been very difficult trying to come up with a context that would work for people in different cultures and stuff. The last conversation that I had with a bunch of systems thinkers about this and cybernetics people, Alexander Laszlo pointed out that, certain of the scenarios that I had thought of using wouldn't work in other countries. Like,
Right.
The whole idea of roasting a marshmallow, roasting the perfect marshmallow, from distance from the heat and how hot the heat is, and how long of time before you flip your marshmallow so it roasts just the way you want it. Your goal is kind of driving this whole thing. But if if the heat sort of dissipates, then you have to change all your relations with it so that you get the perfect marshmallow. And it's like,
Does that quite
Yeah.
well, Judith. I mean, system dynamics fails on hierarchical part whole systems and perspective and things like that. But it,
yeah,
one thing it does well is the regulation of the relationship, that you can then change it and then simulate it out. And,
right.
you know,
So I was thinking traffic at intersections might be the relational context that would work, because we've all done that, even, you know, in India and in Brazil and in China and places that, you know, except for people who wouldn't, you know, people in the Amazon rainforest wouldn't
most
know
of the
about that.
successful
But
models in traffic are agent-based models. So they
right.
put rules, and then you get an agent-based model that.
But if you play
one
with the values for who's going through the intersection when,
right.
for how long the light stays in various, you know, all the relational parts, you might recognize that, okay, what an intersection is when cars in different directions have to use the same space without hurting each other, you know, so everybody gets where they want to go. And so you could then keep the game or the exercise pretty simple, but have very, like, you know, obvious differences in outcome. You'd have like total cars crashing into each other if you change the relations in one way or something.
And there is a cultural, you'd have to include the people in the model, wouldn't you? I had a really nice bit of fun today when I sort of picked up somebody for using a car as a mechanistic model, and then I realized that a car is only a mechanistic model if you take the people out of the picture.
Right. And then it sits there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and,
It's an extension of humanity, really.
What's
right?
the point of a car without people? So, you know, but my point is there are cultural differences there, and when a traffic light goes out in maybe, let's say, the USA, that might be sort of a moment of carnage and then gridlock. If you go to
India.
my personal experience, Vietnam, and what's his name? The Bill Bryson has a great little thing about suddenly, or maybe it's Douglas Adams, doesn't matter. Suddenly realizing that the reason people are ringing their bicycle bells is not as a warning, but as a here I am, here I am, here I am, here I am.
Yeah.
And the trick in Vietnam is to step confidently and at a predictable pace into the middle of the flow of traffic, and allow yourself to be predictable to the others who will then flow and work around you. So there's a very different set of relationships there. I mean, or you could just look at traffic lights and a roundabout as an example of the different ways that people are collaborating. And that's a nice little, you know, example, isn't it? A rules-based, competitive, I have the right when it's green, I have zero rights when it's red, versus some other type of collaborative relationship.
In the modeling of those scenarios, it's all rule-based. It's just different rules.
Mhm.
And so we can model the Vietnamese intersections, and we can, using modeling, we can account for the millions of relationships and interactions that are going on. But that accountage is actually the interaction rules between the agents. And we can model that system just like we can model a highway in the United States, and we get near perfect results in terms of the modeling. And we can measure an astronomical number of interactions as a result of those.
It would have to be a mind-bogglingly
that we're up
sophisticated model. Yeah, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, one of the things, though, is that what we're actually talking about is collaboration at the same time as change.
Yeah.
And so it's not just collaboration like in traffic, because what we're actually trying to do is change the traffic rules while we're collaborating. And that's where I feel like, you know, there's these issues of, you know, unlike the predictive business, the thing we need to do is actually to help to generate systems change. We're going to have to shift those relationships that produce the predictive qualities, because that's a continuance. So,
and we have to work out the context cues
a
that will.
A little challenge.
Well, sorry, just that thing about creating the space. You've already said that in a world that's geared for competition, and you know that's contextual and all the rest, to then say, and here we are collaborating. Well,
Hmm.
it works as far as it works, because there's many examples of it in the most competitive fields in our culture, but it doesn't work as far as it doesn't work. So the question is, what are the cues, the context cues, the behavioral triggers that get people to drop into that relational contextual space? I think that's a lot of what you are working with in the kind of warm data labs. And what are the implications of those cues? That would be an interesting challenge to work on, I think.
How do you avoid the tragedy of the commons? That's one of the things that we need to kind of consider in terms of regulating capitalism, regulating our own behavior, regulating economics, and all of those things, because there will, for example, be someone who ignores the rules that everybody else is operating by, because there's a short-term gain that they see for themselves, and they feel like they could grab it and get out. And then what do you do then? You have to find ways to regulate that if they won't regulate themselves, and maybe teach kids how to regulate themselves and make that a big priority too. Because self-control is really essential to freedom. And a lot of people think freedom means you don't need to use any self-control, but it won't work. It's not sustainable then. So this is one of the big issues in the US right now with COVID, because people who think, you can't tell me I have to wear a mask. Yes, we can. It's sort of like, wait a minute, you don't get to risk everybody else's life. You can go risk your own, but by not wearing a mask, you're hurting other people potentially, and that's just not acceptable.
I would just put out there for that, again, that kind of alternative is humans. We all have frustrating examples of negative collaboration, but generally speaking, in the big picture of things, we're actually phenomenally good at collaborating. So much so that we've, taken over most of the planet, with some negative consequences, obviously, and unintended consequences. But all of those negative consequences come from our faculty with collaboration, not our deficit of collaboration.
So they're just doing it with the wrong models in their head about what the goals are or what they think they see.
You could say that, but if you look at Steven Pinker's big data, more people today live further away from murder. More people today live further away from war. More people today live in democracies. More people today have better lives than ever before in human history. So that the trend is not, when in our local environment, sometimes we see everything as being quite negative because there's news coming in and all that. But if you look at the big scale trend of humanity, the trend is in a good direction, not a bad direction.
And it's been competition as well as collaboration that's got us here, for good and bad.
Yeah.
So there's the bind for you.
And also, the way nature does things is not the way we want to do them. I mean, a lot of people think nature is this gentle, kind lady, Gaia theory and all that. And that's bullshit. If you've ever watched nature do its thing without any intervention, holy crap, I mean, parasitism exists in this world, and it's horrific. It's horrific. And if you watch, I grew up watching nature documentaries. They usually used to edit out all the really harsh parts, but they don't do that anymore. And now with the internet, you can find them anyway. But people who think nature is kind have not been paying attention closely enough, because we want to improve on that. We want to build more, mutualistic, symbiotic relationships with each other than the whole predator-prey balance that an ecosystem will eventually find with a whole lot of carnage, on its own. So we are trying to use some ethics and some compassion and some, what is absolutely necessary and what isn't really necessary anymore here. Like, do we need an industry that grows lab animals that we then, torture to death and look at their body parts and stuff? I mean, these are the kinds of things that I don't know really how to even phrase. I've never brought that up before in one of my talks, but, when we want to build a safer, more balanced human community, we would really like to improve and moderate some of the parts of ourselves that just, if left alone to their biological extreme, would wipe out anybody who's inconvenient or whatever.
Well, isn't that just the thing of it, Judith, also that sometimes I feel like when the discussion of, we need to collaborate comes up, that it becomes kind of a sterile invitation. And the juiciness and the bubbliness and the surprise and the difficulties of life are in the things we don't understand that are coming from all sides. And so somehow I think for me this invitation of to think about what is collaboration also really needs to have a freaky factor, like the weird is important in collaboration. It's very important.
Yeah.
And so, viva the weird.
Yeah.
I would love to say in terms of EOST, one of the things that I find we just don't do enough of a simple rule is just ask people, what do you mean?
Yeah.
I think if everybody just asked the question before they answered in a thread, what do you mean?
Yeah.
It would change the dynamic of conversation online a lot.
Yes.
So as a simple rule, rather than saying, this is what they said, this is what I think they mean, I'm going to answer to that. Just what do you mean by that? Let me clarify and make sure that I understand what you mean before I respond. I think that would change social media conversations quite a bit.
Well, and also
Oh, yeah.
the fact that you can't read tone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And tone is so critical to human conversation that in the absence of it, you have to be much more careful.
Yeah.
In how you ask, how you inquire, all of those things.
This is true.
Oh, I've come to call communication platforms because it's just flattening the communication. And how are we supposed to find that, like you were saying, the tone? I mean, that's the warm data. How do you do it? We're missing so much information.
Yeah.
Peter
Facebook
suggested
tried
that as a
to-
topic for next time. I think that's a really valid topic for next time. What can we actually practically call upon to set that tone, create those cues?
Mhm.
I think that would be fun.
Or just simple rules that individual people can practice, and then the interactions will come from those rules.
Yeah.
Like if you just ask, what do I mean? What do you mean?
Mhm.
Yeah.
More
Or
often.
what do I mean?
Yeah, what do I mean? Yeah, like half the time I'm ordering that.
Yep.
Yeah.
This has been great. Do we feel like we should wrap it here? I think that's a nice bow on it.
Yep,
Yeah.
that feels good. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Fun
Yeah.
talking
And
with you.
let's do it again soon.
Definitely plan for a next time, though.
Yes.
Yeah,
A lot
absolutely.
of people out there.
Lots to talk
Thank
about.
you very much, everyone.
Yeah,
Oh,
thank you.
wonderful.
It was
Thanks
fun.
for inviting me. I enjoyed
Thank
it.
you.
Yeah,
It's
great.
good to-
Thank you.
Take
Bye,
care,
everybody.
everybody. Be safe.
Everybody.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.